The clock that Howard was referring to is mine. I never run overtime because I carry a large wristwatch that I can keep track of. It's kind of a funny story. I've been, for the last 15 years speaking about full-time for the Heartland Institute, traveling all over North America. And when I started doing this, I had an agent that booked me for them. And he said, well, you got to go to a professional and get some advice how to speak professionally. I figured I'd given 700 academic papers by then. And spent 3 days with this fellow, and I wouldn't name him because he was a pompous ass. And he basically taught me everything I never wanted to do as a speaker. But it was still worth it because he said, carry a big clock and never go overtime. People will like you. So I took that advice to heart. A couple opening comments. This is incredibly exciting to be here. But before I get into the nuclear aspects, Howard's talk was excellent. And a few years ago, there was a talk on low-level radiation here, maybe 4 years ago, Jane would remember, by Ed Heiserat, who wrote a book called Low-Level Radiation that is really outstanding. And if you're really interested in all the wonderful things about low-level radiation, which Howard brought out, I would recommend that you get a hold of that book. It's in print, and it doesn't cost very much. You get it on Amazon.com. I've heard some great things here. First of all, hearing Fred Singer. One of the neat things about coming and speaking at DDP is you really can say anything you want. I mean, you can really be open, although when we get political, you saw Howard move away from the podium to make his wonderful comments about Art, who, of course, we all want to see elected in a couple of months. But I heard Fred Singer discussing the climate alarmists, and he used the word evil, and I just love that because I think they are evil. I was chided by my boss, Joe Bast at Heartland, when I keynoted a talk in Chicago at the conference just a month ago. And when I was asked a question, I was saying some things like you heard Chris Horner say last night about the problems with capitalism and the capitalists who don't defend it. I made a comment that capitalism as a system is terrific, but capitalists can be incredibly unethical. But socialism as a system really sucks. I got in a lot of trouble for just speaking my mind. I know none of you here would mind that. My background in nuclear energy is really very interesting, and it's why I'm here. And by the way, my entire talk is written out in narrative form in your packets. In fact, it was published in the British Journal in April, Energy and the Environment. So everything I'm going to say you can read later. But how I got into this field is fairly interesting. I took nuclear physics from John Wheeler at Princeton, and John was one of the people on the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. That's number one. I had a nodding acquaintance with Albert Einstein, and there are very few people that can say that. When I say I had a nodding acquaintance, you want to take me absolutely literally. I was a freshman at Princeton when Albert walked literally behind my dorm room every day on his way from his home a couple blocks away to his office. And on many occasions, I walked by Albert and we nodded. It drives my son crazy that I cannot describe an interesting conversation that I had with Albert, because at the age of 17, I never could think of anything to say, and did not. The third reason, I also in the Navy knew Hyman Rickover. Manny Medeiros is here in the audience. He worked with Hyman for 20 years. But again, I met him. But those three things got me an interesting job with the Armed Forces Institute while I was a professor at Ohio State. They came to me and asked me to write their first correspondence course on nuclear physics and nuclear energy, which I did. So I go back about the same 50, almost the same 50 years that Howard described. Before I get into it, I want to make one last comment. It's really interesting I've been teaching things related to nuclear energy for 50 years, and I have always laughingly begun my talks by saying nuclear energy is not rocket science. It's kind of a colloquialism. Well, after Friday at NASA, I can now say it with the deepest sincerity. Nuclear energy, nuclear physics is so much easier than what they did at NASA in building those rockets and sending a spaceship off to the moon. But I want to make one last comment that was fascinating to me. I'm working on a paper trying to undermine climate modeling, mathematical climate modeling, something I've been involved in mathematical modeling my whole career. But I saw something on Friday that gave me an idea that you all might find useful. And in a sense, everything I'm going to say in this talk is trying to arm you with information that you can use to spread good words and battle evil, in a sense. And one is that the public, the only reason they believe in climate change the way the media and our opposition, the alarmists, have been telling them, is that they are told that these climate models make projections that are of some value. I'm trying to shift the idea of the climate model and call it a simulation. And it really came through to me at NASA on Friday that a simulation is where you try to figure out how some physical system works. You collect a few variables that you can deal with, and you create a mathematical equation that simulates reality. But the problem with a simulation is that there is no real-time feedback. If you chose the wrong variables, you gave those variables the wrong numbers, or the relationships that you decided exist between the variables, essentially your solution is going to run off a cliff and you'll never know. You come out with an end result you don't know. In firing off the satellites to the moon, and Scott Carpenter can correct me later if I'm wrong about this, but in watching all the films, particularly the moon landing film over there, you realize that they really never had an exact solution to landing Neil Armstrong and the other 11 people or 10 people that followed those two in later launches. They didn't have an exact solution. They had a solution that was pretty good. But without real-time feedback all the way along, it would be very easy for the rocket to the moon to have missed the moon or landed in a rubble field. And if you saw the movie, Neil Armstrong had to take over the controls and make the landing because things didn't work out right. A solution takes variables that are known, comes up with a relationship between them, but gets real-time feedback. And a simulation does not. And so it's just something for you to know that might be useful when you try to undermine the validity of the climate models that we look at. Okay, moving on. I'm going to cover 6 areas of nuclear energy today. I want to give you a little bit of the history. I'm going to talk about the accidents that have occurred, the problems with nuclear waste, problems with nuclear reprocessing, a little bit about safety, and then conclude with a bit of futurist ideas of where I think we're going with this whole thing. Let me start by saying that the first nuclear power plant was actually set up by Enrico Fermi in 1942. And he knew, and his graduate students that helped him set it up, realized, again, that it was not rocket science, even though there wasn't much rocket science to that at that time. Forcing U-235 to fission and create heat is really not very difficult. So you need to know that from the beginning. I mean, you refine U-235, you create pellets of the material about the size of a pencil eraser, you fill them into a stainless steel rod, you bundle the rods together, you sit them in a tank of water. The water gets hot from the radiation. The heat moves from the tank of water across a metal barrier into water that is not exposed to nuclear radiation. The water heats up, becomes steam. The steam is channeled into a turbine. The turbine blades turn, and we have electricity. It really is that simple. Even the chemistry isn't that difficult. I mean, the problems are obviously ensuring that the radiation is not exposed to people. What is so fabulous about nuclear energy is that a pound of it, about the size of a baseball you can hold in your hand, is the equivalent to 1 million gallons of gasoline, automotive gasoline, that powers us. 1 pound equivalent to 1 million gallons of gasoline. A ton of U-235 nuclear fuel is the equivalent of 2 to 3 million tons of fossil fuel. I say 2 to 3 because it depends on whether it's natural gas or coal or oil. 2 to 3 million tons is the equivalent of a single ton of nuclear fuel. So the power is absolutely amazing. Okay, so Fermi was working at the University of Chicago and set up the first reactor in 1942. And this was kind of at the same time that the Manhattan Project was going on. But his work was entirely funded in the area of nuclear propulsion. The whole idea was to figure out how to make a nuclear power plant that would drive a ship. In 1954, we did two things simultaneously. The first power plant was built by Duquesne Power and Light in Shippingport, Pennsylvania. The first commercial nuclear power plant in 1954. That is the same year we launched the Nautilus submarine, the first Nautilus ship. We now have 444 nuclear power plants operating in the world in 33 different countries. We have 104 plants. We have the most in the world. These 104 plants in 1998 produced 674 billion kilowatts of energy in 1998. Kilowatt hours, excuse me. Now they produce 800 billion kilowatt hours. In 12 years, we've improved dramatically the efficiency of these plants by the equivalency of having built 26 new plants, though we have not built a single plant in over 30 years. By more improvement of the plants, the equipment, and our procedures, we've made these dramatic improvements, but we've not built a plant. The 444 plants in 33 countries. Next to us would come France. They have 59 plants and produce, as most everybody knows, about 80% of their electric energy. Next comes Japan. They have 55 plants and produce about half of their electric energy. Then comes the United Kingdom. They have 35 plants, produce 23% of their energy. Russia, as I recall, has 29 plants. Germany has 20. And I don't remember what percentage of their electricity is produced. China has 7. But they have 132 on the drawing board, ready for completion by 2020. We've had in the world 3 major accidents. I'll bet nobody here could tell me the first nuclear accident in the world that created a... Okay, I'm wrong. 1957, wind scale in the United Kingdom was a meltdown. There was a cloud of nuclear radiation that did escape the plant. To the best of anyone's knowledge, there was never a fatality and really no significant reported health effects as well. So our first problem, 57, not a problem. Most people have forgotten that one. But of course, we all remember the big problem in 1979 with 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island set back the nuclear industry a great deal. It was a meltdown. It was a miscalculation of the instrumentation that allowed the system to operate without correct procedures. It misread what was going on, caused a meltdown, caused radioactive water to escape, but into a containment building. And to the best of our knowledge, there has not been a single health impact besides what the alarmists said. It turns out that 3 Mile Island was a boon to the nuclear industry from a technical standpoint, because it led to a very large number of tremendous improvements in nuclear power plant construction from that time forward. We've already heard that Jane Fonda and the China syndrome really set back the nuclear industry. But the single thing that occurred that all but destroyed forward progress, at least in this country, occurred on April 26, 1986, and we all know that about was the Chernobyl accident. What few people in the world, and probably most of you are aware, but few people elsewhere are aware, is that Chernobyl was a power plant that could never have been built anywhere else in the Western world. It would not have satisfied the safety standards of any country on Earth when it was built. It had no containment structure. When something went wrong with where the rods were in the water or any kind of a meltdown, everything would escape. The idea of building a nuclear plant without a safety containment structure is actually ridiculous. The nature of our containment of our nuclear power plants today is such that if the planes that hit the World Trade Tower and the Pentagon were to be aimed at a nuclear power plant, the primary result would be that everybody on the plane would be killed and the plane would be destroyed, and possibly the power plant would be shut down temporarily, but they literally could have done very little damage because of the containment features of a power plant. The accident in Chernobyl was not a meltdown. It was a fire. It was a fire. Anybody want, well, you probably know. You've heard papers about it, so I won't make it a guessing game. In the end, 31 firemen and others died of radiation exposure as a result of the fire. 1,800 people got, Howard, tell me, what was the disease?
Well, thyroid cancer.
Thyroid cancer. 1,800 cases of thyroid cancer were reported. 99% of them were cured. The death rate was very tiny among that group. It took some years, and I think it may have been reported at this meeting maybe 10 years ago now. The United Nations Scientific Committee on Efficient Atomic Radiation, it goes by the acronym UNSCARE, kind of scary in itself, UNSCARE, came out with a 1,220-page report which totally told the whole truth and undid all of the damaging information that went around through the media and was spread by the movie The China Syndrome and all that. So Chernobyl was the absolute worst case situation. I mean, if you had set out to build the unsafest, worst plant to train your staff poorly or not at all to create an accident waiting to happen, it would have been Chernobyl. But few people ever learned that. I mean, if you're not kind of in the nuclear industry, if you're really not on the inside, you would buy all the terrible publicity that virtually eliminated the nuclear power industry in this country. Let's move on to waste. Let's start off by the fact that Mr. Obama, a month or two ago, canceled Yucca Mountain. I can't remember how many tens of billions of dollars we've spent in studying different sites and building Yucca Mountain, but he canceled it. I know precisely why he canceled it. One very simple reason, because I know people working at Yucca. I'm very tied into the state in many ways. Would anybody like to tell me the single precise reason why Mr. Obama canceled Yucca? Howard? Howard and Fred Singer have the right answer. One reason only: to try to get Harry Reid reelected. Without Yucca being canceled, Harry Reid would have been toast. Hopefully he could still be beaten by Sharon Angle, who got the Republican nomination. She's a Tea Party gal with not a whole lot of background, but there is hope that she could beat him. But the fact that Obama would flush billions down the toilet, totally disrupt the nuclear industry for one political gain is reprehensible. I won't get. I think I can define Obama as a man who cares only about himself. I think every single thing he does, including all the oil spills, is how is this going to make me look, not what can I do for the country. People that study the presidents recognize that most presidents grow in office. We've really elected some, kind of average, moderate dunderheads into the presidency, and with few exceptions, they got better. They grew in office. They took on the mantle of responsibility, and they became better people. That is clearly not the case with Mr. Obama. Well, what is the waste problem? First of all, the nuclear industry has been pouring money, which they have to do on a regular basis for every amount of electricity that's sold. They put money into a reserve for the construction of waste disposal. There are some nuclear power companies now that are going to sue the government to try to stop paying that money because there's no longer a repository. Now, I would argue that we don't need a repository on a number of grounds. I mean, I was never particularly in favor of Yucca, but I defend Yucca as a perfectly adequate site that can hold a significant quantity of waste for a number of decades. There is zero question in my mind it would have been safe. The geology of the area has been studied meticulously. But we really don't need it on two levels. First of all, we have 60 years of nuclear energy waste in this country, starting back 1954, that'd be 56 years of nuclear power plant waste. Now, the average plain water nuclear power plant produces anywhere from 80 to 150 tons of low-level waste a year. A pressurized water reactor produces between 20 and 75 tons of low-level radioactive waste a year. All of the waste that our 104 plants have produced in these past near 50 years would make a pile about 10 feet high within the boundaries of a single football field. So we're still, even though we don't have a repository, we still do not have a great deal of waste. Where's the waste now? It's at 121 different sites in 39 states throughout the country. How is it stored? Well, most of it, after a couple of years, the rods that contain the pellets of U-235 become inefficient as heat producers, and they're pulled out and replaced and set in another water pool, a contained water pool, where they just cool for some period of time and become less radioactive and less radioactive as time goes on. A good number of them are stored in dry casks, in stainless steel containers inside cement casks. So we have dry storage and we have wet storage. We've been doing this for 56 years, and there has never been a problem, and frankly, we can continue to do it for many, many more years. However, other countries do not have this waste problem. France has been in the nuclear business big time for 30 years with most of their 59 reactors, and their waste volume is about 3% of ours, and they store all of their nuclear waste beneath the floor of a single room of a building in Le Hague. Why do they not have much waste? Why does Japan not have much of a waste problem? Why do most nations of the world not have much of a waste problem? Because they reprocess. They reprocess the fuel with a relatively simple, chemical equation and bring it back up to speed and use it again. When our rods are taken out, 95% of the energy is left in them. We really only extract 5% of what we could. Why? Because the brilliant Jimmy Carter in 1977 made it illegal to reprocess our nuclear waste. Now, he did it for two reasons. I mean, I think Jimmy Carter is a very nice man. I really do. I think he had already reached senility when elected to the presidency, however. And I know that he graduated, if not the bottom of his class at the Naval Academy, in the bottom 3. And he reasoned that in the reprocessing, accurately, to a half extent, of nuclear fuel, plutonium is created. Plutonium is U-239. And he said, well, plutonium is how we make atomic bombs. So we really can't go around reprocessing our waste and create weapons-grade plutonium, which someone could come in and steal and make a bomb, and we'd be in trouble. So he did it for that technical reason, which I'll explain in a moment was incorrect. And secondly, he thought, he was a peace-loving guy. I mean, he hugs everybody, including Hugo Chavez, as you may recall. He reasoned that all the countries of the world would follow suit, and we would eliminate this threat. Maybe someone in this audience can correct me, or maybe one of the Robinsons can correct me. I don't know of any country that followed suit. I don't know of any country that has the capability to reprocess their waste that is not doing it. Now, the technical error that he made is that the plutonium that's created in the reprocessing is not weapons grade because it's contaminated with 4 other isotopes. It's absolutely useless. And if you really want, if you do buy Ed Heiserot's book on low-level radiation, he has a chapter which creates the most incredible scenario of what it would be like to rush into a reprocessing plant and steal the waste. I mean, it's just humorous how you got to get the trucks through the guard, and somehow you've got to get into the building, and you've got to get material that's going to kill you instantly if you carry it out. I mean, I don't think he wrote it as a comedy scene, but it would make almost a good Three Stooge movie. But Jimmy Carter, again, a nice man, either not very bright to begin with or senile, and I really do believe that. I don't say that jokingly. Now, in 1992, Ronald Reagan rescinded the Carter executive order and made it legal to reprocess. But nobody has done it. And that kind of goes into what Chris Horner was telling us about last night. None of the nuclear power plants wanted to mess with something that was not politically correct, that was not attractive. They recognized, you know, the guns they would be under from the nuclear alarmists. So it has not been done. Eventually, it's got to be done, but it has not been done up to now. All right, let's talk about the safety. And these are facts. Again, all this in my paper, but I want to arm you with some numbers that are very easy to remember that you want to spread in conversation to at any opportunity you can, because it'll dazzle people with your knowledge and it will make them very optimistic and understanding. Now, public opinion about nuclear power has shifted dramatically. The majority of the population at the time of Jane Fonda and the China Syndrome were dead set against any more nuclear power. Today, the numbers in favor of continuing with nuclear power are closing in on 70%. And while Obama, I'm not sure how smart or not smart he is, how knowledgeable or not knowledgeable is, but I know he's shrewd. And so, as you heard Chris Horner last night say, that he's promised a couple $2 billion for loan support for nuclear power plants, making it look like he's in favor of nuclear energy, while at the same time shutting down our one repository we've worked on for decades. So it's a bait and switch. He's really not in favor of it. But here's the safety record. And I think everybody in this... well, let me first tell you that 4 people have died in the nuclear power industry, but not in a commercial power plant. In the Raft River Research Project in Idaho in 1976, 4 people did die in an experimental nuclear power system. Most of you do know how many people have died since 1954 in commercially operated nuclear power plants in the world. That's in 444 power plants that now exist. Most of you know exactly how many people have died in accidents. As I said. Yes, Howard?
0.
Right, the answer is 0. We've talked about that. Nobody has ever died. 200 people a year die in fossil fuel power plants. Coal-fired, gas-fired. I mean, there are accidents. The death rate around the world is about 200 a year. No one has ever died. Well, how about this one? This is better. In 54, as I told you, we launched the Nautilus submarine. We built 200 nuclear vessels. 82 of them are still operating. They have traveled 150 million miles. They are welcomed at 150 ports of call in the world, in 50 countries. There has never been a fatality. I don't even know of a serious injury, though there may be one, in a nuclear vessel in the world. I mean, it's absolutely astounding, the safety record. I mean, it's just hard to believe. It is the safest form of power. It is the safest industry that exists on the planet. We're moving in that direction. People are beginning to recognize it. Most people, this is neat. I would guess that your average young person at the age of between 15 and 25 may not have ever heard of Jane Fonda. Isn't that wonderful? You know. So, and Chernobyl and these things are falling behind, but we still need to work harder to make sure that people understand the safety. What is the future? It is not bright. It is not bright at all. First of all, the government has instituted safety requirements on our nuclear power plants that are really over the top. A nuclear power plant used to cost between $2 and $4 billion. The price for a 1,000 megawatt plant today is in the range of $6 to $9 billion. So we can no longer say that they're inexpensive. There are 34 applications for nuclear power plants. The Nuclear Regulatory Committee opened up for new applications to build new plants, and there is this false sense that we're moving forward, that the nuclear industry is coming back. And yet one thing Chris Horner didn't mention about Exelon last night, who is going to make big bucks on carbon, is that Exelon is the biggest nuclear power company in the United States, which probably makes it the biggest in the world, I'm not sure. They're a nuclear power company, and they're excited about the potential of cap and trade to make them money. But in any case, 34 companies have applied, 34 plants, not 34 companies, but there have been applications to build 34 new power plants. For reasons I don't know, and maybe somebody can answer the question in the Q&A, it takes 5 years for an application to be approved. Well, I mean, for the beginning, we know it's government workers, so that, is not the most efficient process. But I don't know what the protocol is that anything could take 5 years. And this is a question, what will happen the day after the first application is approved? Lawsuits. Got to take another 5 years. I think I can predict we will not have a nuclear power plant as early as 2020, at which time China will have 132. Let me describe something interesting. In 2006, the Chinese sent a delegation to the United States to study our nuclear power plants. And we welcomed them in and took them around to all the best plants. What is interesting is that they thought to see correctly to come to the United States to learn the most about nuclear power in a country that hadn't built a plant in 30 years. Even though we have not built plants, we have still, up till that time, and maybe still today, retained the most knowledge and the most expertise in nuclear power. So they came and looked at the different systems. And they decided that they liked the Westinghouse nuclear power plants the best, and they were going to take that technology back. And you'd say, wow, that's going to be a real shot in the arm for the nuclear power industry in the United States. Who would like to tell me why that is not so any longer? Because Toshiba bought Westinghouse. So the Chinese will now be using Japanese technology. Of the 34 applications, 20 have applied to use the Westinghouse, now Toshiba technology. 9 are using French Areva technology, and the remaining 5 are still looking at what GE is doing, but GE has now formed a joint program with Hitachi, and GE is talking about getting out of the business altogether for, the kind of reasons, the bureaucratic morass that exists here. Now, a bright spot on the horizon. First of all, let me tell you that we're now at the 4th generation of nuclear power plants. We haven't. I'm not sure if we've built a Gen 3 or I know we haven't built a Gen 4, but I mean we have plans for dramatically improved systems where the safety is certainly an order of magnitude greater than the early power plants, which, as I've already stated, have not had any problems to begin with. In South Africa, they're building, as we speak, a pebble bed reactor that can be built in modules as small as 250 megawatts and connected together. And the pebble bed reactor is interesting because It has inherent safety instead of built-in safety. It uses, instead of eraser-sized pieces of U-235, it uses tennis ball-sized clumps of uranium totally covered by a ceramic that will not melt until it gets to 3,000 degrees centigrade. And the actual nuclear plant operates at 900 degrees centigrade. And if it ever heats up to 1,600 degrees centigrade, it reverses itself. So it's virtually impossible in a pebble bed reactor to have a meltdown. And that's even a really exciting future technology. More important than that, a number of companies, including Babcock Wilcox in the United States, but Russia is the leader, are building self-contained nuclear power plants of a small size. I've seen something as big as 125 megawatts, but I've seen smaller ones that are smaller than a single railroad car, that are literally trucked to a location, set on the ground or set in the ground in a hole, and operate self-contained for as much as 30 years. Does anyone want to correct me on the 30 years? I may be wrong. Anyone know if it's in that order? And they use helium as a coolant in the system, and the pebble bed reactor uses helium too. And of course, the neat thing about helium as a coolant versus water, if any of it escapes, it's gone into the atmosphere, and there's less danger there. I think we're going to see, well, not in our lifetime, but I have no doubt that some centuries from now, we'll have nuclear-powered refrigerators. I've even heard about nuclear-powered watches, the miniature. We're talking, centuries from now. And I think I can predict, obviously, it's easy to predict something 100 years out, but I think in 100 years, the world will operate on nuclear energy. What saddens me is that when we worldwide, or this country, goes back to nuclear energy, I'm terribly afraid the country is going to look like, I don't know if you've ever seen these Australian movies, Mad Max. I don't know, was that how Mel Gibson got fame? Things were really bad, and you've seen a number of futuristic movies where nothing looks good around the countryside, but they're really missing what will be filling the screen, or, filling the countryside. It will be windmills that are broken, fallen over, missing blades, not operating, and the earth will be strewn with solar mirrors and photovoltaic cells hanging off rooftops. That's where we're going to go. The beauty, of course, and it was a great interchange between Louisa and George Gilder yesterday, and I asked George whether Louisa, who is this brilliant physicist, really didn't know what George told her about wind and solar and coal. And George said that Louisa just likes to provoke him, and that very likely she does know. But a nuclear power plant requires 200 acres of land to develop 1,000 megawatts of power, 200 acres. Howard Hayden, who constantly comes to this meeting but isn't here today, has written a phenomenal, well, 2 books actually, first and second, Solar Fraud. And he runs calculations on how much land is required for 1,000 megawatts of wind and 1,000 megawatts of solar. And he's absolutely a brilliant physicist, and I trust his numbers. You're reading lower numbers, it hardly matters, but he calculates 300 square miles to produce 1,000 megawatts of wind. That's a mile width from Los Angeles to San Francisco. He calculates for solar mirrors about 187 square miles for 1,000 megawatts. And land is very valuable. We really can't do that. If you really want all the data on solar and wind, you can't beat Howard's book called Solar Fraud. He covers actually all of the renewable energy. Well, I wish I could be more optimistic. I'm only optimistic long term because the government will run out of money printing money to support wind and solar. They can never operate on their own. And I don't recall, I think George mentioned in his answer to Louisa also, that in fact, wind and solar is way worse for the environment than fossil fuel, because the numbers that people are not aware of is that either wind power systems or solar power systems use orders of magnitude more cement and steel than does a fossil fuel power plant. And the mining of these incredible quantities of cement and steel obviously have an environmental impact that far exceeds any of the gases coming out of a plant. And of course, trying to make carbon dioxide evil is absolutely humorous. So on the short term, while the public is thinking things are looking good, in fact, they're not. But I think they will. I mean, we will run out of money to support the renewables, hopefully before we really do look like Australia in the Mad Max movies. I don't think we'll get to that devastating point. I am totally optimistic that there will be a sea change in November, and that in 2 years after that, we can find a person with a conscience to run for office and win. So long term, I am optimistic. Short term, I am not. I am going to end there and would be delighted to have anybody add some things I left out or ask me questions or make comments. I think we have the clock on the table, not the clock on the wall, says we have 12 minutes. Yes?
I just want to say that the book, Ed Heiserant's book,
yes.
is fabulous. It should be mandatory reading. It's called Underexposed.
I called it low-level radiation. It's called Underexposed. If you want to read a review of it, kind of a Cliff Notes, the heartland.org website archives, I think, all my book reviews. But thank you for that. It really is fabulous. And if you want to buy great cookies in New York, you want to see this young lady. She has the best cookie shop on 50th Street in New York City. My wife and I are going 2 days before Thanksgiving. So, yes.
I'm Hugh Wise. I'm retired in just up the road in Gainesville. And I'd like to, I've heard in respect to why should Exelon be so interested in cap and trade. When I was employed there in Washington, I used to go over to the CEI and listen in on their meetings. And I was startled to learn that one of the reasons Exelon might be interested in promoting the cap and trade is because when the cap and trade bill was first ginned up, there was a provision that nuclear power plants which generate no CO2 were to be given carbon credits, allocated carbon credits, which they could then sell. So is that?
That's absolutely true. I know that to be true. I have been an opponent of the nuclear industry on ethics basis for 20 years. Since the global warming alarming ridiculousness started, the nuclear industry has used it to promote themselves. We don't put out greenhouse gases. Now, even though nuclear physics is not rocket science, anybody who is a competent nuclear physicist and is a scientist in the industry has to know that carbon dioxide has no impact on our climate. And the fact that these people could promote themselves by saying we don't put out greenhouse gases to heat the atmosphere has been a problem for me with their industry. So, I mean, you really can use a broad brush in painting these big capitalist companies, whatever they do, as lacking in ethics.
I don't understand why somebody can produce TV ads like the coal companies do about clean coal. Why doesn't somebody put you on TV every day?
Well, that's very...
Where are these damn companies? Where's the money?
You know, that's very kind of you, and I use that in many of my lectures about environmental issues. There is one industry that escaped the clutches of environmental alarmism 25 years ago, and they were immortalized in the famous movie The Graduate. So you all know what industry I'm talking about. Plastics. The plastic people were smart enough when the environmental zealots started after American industry to destroy capitalism to run these public relations ads just saying how important plastic was in your life without promoting a certain product. And you're indeed correct, that's what these industries should be doing now. But instead, what are they doing? They're promoting wind and solar. I mean, I don't feel sorry for BP. I mean, it was a terrible accident. Someone asked a question about, was it a torpedo? No. I mean, I started out as a petroleum engineer, and I've already written a paper about this. I mean, it was an accident. A lot of mistakes were made, but that BP, well, I hope they don't go bankrupt because a lot of people in the United Kingdom have all their retirement savings in BP. But the fact that they have been making a name for themselves these past years in wind and solar is about as dishonest as could be.
Maybe this is better for Dr. McAbee, but I'm sure I'd like to hear your comment. The Underexposed book has a picture of people going to Austria there to sit in a cave with a stream going by to get exposed to radon gas. There's a website for that. And
you can do that in Montana, by the way.
Okay, that saves airfare.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I read, maybe someone else could comment. I understand that the highest amount of radon gas in basements in the United States is in the state of Iowa, and apparently Iowa has the lowest breast cancer rate.
You're correct. It is Iowa, and Bernie Cohen has written extensively from the University of Pittsburgh that all the counties, every county in America, and they looked at all 3,000 plus counties, or I'm not sure what the number is, that the more radon you have, the lower the cancer rate. And it walks step by step with Howard McAbee and the atomic bomb in Japan, and basically that's what Bernie Cohen, leaping off knowing that the cancer rates were lower in Japan a few miles away, he looked at radon in the whole country, and the EPA is still promoting the radon removal industry when in fact radon, like CO2, is a good thing at certain levels, not super high levels. Yes?
We're all concerned with the birds in the Gulf. I think 1,000 birds have been killed or died. But I thought there were 30 or 40,000 were killed by windmills every year. Is that?
Yeah, the windmill sacrifice is gigantic. The Audubon Society is starting to count them. And it's interesting that Exxon has been fined a number of times for small oil spills you don't hear about, where a bird goes through and has its wings contaminated. They've paid some significant fines you don't know about, but no windmill has ever been fined for destroying birds. It's really amazing, but if the environmental people who really love birds, the sad thing about most environmental alarmists is not that they love animals, wildlife, and nature. They hate people. So that's what we're on. But you're absolutely right.
On a more serious vein, in Washington, if it's 10 years to build a nuclear plant, you hear that number all the time.
Right.
I'd heard 7 years is the bureaucracy. If it was a standardized plant, how long would it take to build if they could be done efficiently? And then are there also like Davis-Bacon Act and all sorts of things that increase the cost?
Yes.
On the construction.
Right.
After it's approved, what other regulations are there that make the construction incredibly
I
slow?
can't name them all, but the rise in price from 2 to 4 billion of yesterday to 6 to 9 billion today is largely the regulatory costs, the safety costs, rather than the cost of steel and cement. Obviously, that's some of that, but most of it is regulation. The people I talk to in the industry tell me that they could build a plant in 4 years. I mean, if they were not interfered with by the government, the actual construction of a plant could be completed in 4 years. You're probably right in the 7 to 10 year range. So if we're saying these applications are going to take 5 years for approval, figure 5 years in the courts and another 10 years to build them, I'm 100% sure we're not going to have a plant in 2020, maybe 2030.
And the interveners' attorneys are paid for by the taxpayers.
Right. That's been the case from the
I'm
beginning
Richard
of EPA.
Forrester. I started my career at Oak Ridge National Lab many, many years ago, and I worked with all these old guys on molten salt breeder reactors and molten salt reactors and HTGRs and all the rest of them. And the bad thing is all of them are dead. And even young guys like me who started right out of school are getting up there in years. And so all of our technology, I mean, that's the scary part. But the one reason I came up here was I wanted to remind you to mention when you talk about Chernobyl was that the Russian reactors, the reason we had a problem there, the Russian reactors were all production reactors. We don't build production reactors to provide civilian electricity.
Well, now, would you quickly define a production reactor? I'm sure
That's a reactor that's designed to create plutonium.
Okay. Do it both. Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that.
And because
There's
of
one.
that, it has an inverse thermal coefficient.
Okay.
So when it starts to get away, it gets worse.
I did leave out one thing I wanted to tell you before George Gilder speaks. What's interesting is that we get exactly, or almost exactly, half of our nuclear fuel for 104 power plants from the Soviet Union, from Russia. Russia supposedly, as they disassemble their many nuclear weapons, sell us the nuclear material in the weapons. We're not 100% sure that's what they're doing. We're not sure they're not just creating it in a plant itself. But half of our fuel comes from Russia. Since 20% of our electrical energy is nuclear in this country, arithmetic would tell you that 1 out of every 10 light bulbs in America is powered by Russian nuclear fuel. George.
Great speech, as usual, but I wish this demonization of large corporations would stop. They are, as you described them, but they've been virtually nationalized in the United States between the laws that regulate them, the lawyers that litigate them, the politicians that rate them. They've been made this way by the government. The government's created these institutions in their own image. And I think to blame it on capitalism is really a fundamental error.
No, I have not blamed it on capitalism. I've blamed it on the individuals that run the corporations. I totally agree with everything you say, but these people get up and tell lies to benefit
and
their company.
they rise to the top of these institutions that have been. The other point is that these large corporations are being crippled by this process, so that the average size of a business in the United States has dropped about 50% in the last 25 years. So you're getting more and more small companies to avoid these oppressive tax levels and regulatory schemes.
I don't disagree with anything you say, George, but I will tell you for sure, Goldman Sachs is the biggest force behind cap and trade legislation in this country because they will make hundreds of billions of dollars trading nothing on Wall Street.
And they're a government entity.
They are a government entity. Absolutely. Crony capitalism is what it is. Howard.
This is a side comment about George's comment. The three big evils in our society are encapsulated in 3 words that are popularized by Art Robinson in Access to Energy: taxation, regulation, and litigation. So if you don't read Access to Energy, you better start.
Good. Agreed. You know, I knew Peter Beckman and read it long before Art came on the scene, and when Art did, I said, oh, there's no way it can be as good as it was when Peter ran it, but I was certainly wrong about that. It is fabulous.
Amen. About 30 years ago, I was a consultant to PG&E, which was trying to get some power plants, nuclear power plants, built in California, and I went around giving speeches on both the medical and the physics and the engineering aspects of the safety of nuclear power. And I was always amazed that the PG&E executives that I was working for weren't red hot for nuclear power, because I was. It was obvious. And the answer is because the power companies use coal they burn oil sometimes, they use nuclear, et cetera, et cetera. They have multiple ways of producing energy, and so they can't be powerful advocates of one at the expense of the others. And then the larger question is the way that they're regulated and the way their money is made. The point is that they're basically regulated so they can get a certain percentage over and above the cost of electricity they provide. So it's like a cost-plus industry. The more money they charge, the more money they make. That's why they're backing solar and wind power, because if that doubles the price of electricity, they'll make twice as much money. That is a back-asswards way of running our energy production.
Well, both Howard and George are, absolutely right. It's very, very complex, and I think it all starts at government, and maybe one day we'll take our country back. Go.
I forgot to say that there's more than just Jane Fonda, which is terrible. I couldn't even get to raise my hand at her talk once. But there was my friend Ernie Sternglass. You may have heard of him. In my book, which I have out for sale, and I have some flyers because there are not very many of them here, there's Exhibit 3. I dug out of my garage, where he uses my name in vain after 3 Mile Island. There's no way I could refute it. He calls the government as lying, and this is what the public gets, to hate government. I was there in the Atomic Energy Commission when the government did some good things, but you don't hear about that. And now they're all over-regulating, as you say. Now, I just read the book, I just reviewed the book, Radiance of France, by a history professor at Michigan. And it points out how they took over and properly used some of the government to avoid what the Ernst Sternglasses were telling the people, and they adopted our light water reactors, and they threw away their gas coal because it was cleaner. And I've got a letter to the editor I'd like to show you.
I'll look forward to seeing it.
Posted in public. Publish it.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time. Thank you again so very much.